Ray Donovan hated prisons. 23 years on the force hadn't rid him of the uneasy feeling he got at the sound of metal doors slamming shut. The sound was always the same, cold, sharp, final. Like a period at the end of a sentence that no one would want to read. Morgan Hill. Correctional facility was no different from the dozens of others he'd been to. The same gray walls, the same smell of disinfectant trying to mask the deeper, more pervasive sense of despair and mustiness. A stone-faced guard led him silently down a long hallway. It was 6 a.m, and Donovan could still taste the bitterness of hastily drunk coffee in his mouth when the phone call jolted him out of a shallow slumber. Divorce had left him with insomnia and a habit of waking up at the slightest noise, as if his body always expected bad news. Victim is Thomas Murphy, 30 years old, serving time for fraud, found by a guard in the shower room at 4:30 this morning. The guard said without turning his head. Warden Baker is waiting for you there. Donovan nodded. 30 years old. Young. His imagination was already conjuring up images of inconsolable parents, perhaps a young wife. It was always harder for him when the victims were young men. In his 45, he was beginning to feel that the deaths of those who hadn't even lived to be half his age were doubly unfair. Guards and medical personnel crowded around the entrance to the shower room. The shower room was closed off with yellow tape labeled crime scene. Warden Warren Baker stood against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest. A man in his 60s with a military bearing and a cold look in his steely eyes. He looked as if he'd already made up his mind about the case, Detective Donovan, he said without a trace of greeting. I hope we can close this case quickly and quietly. Donovan ignored the comment. He knew Baker from other cases. A former military man who had risen to warden through connections and a reputation for maintaining order at all costs. That order was often achieved by ignoring problems didn't seem to bother Baker. Let me take a look at the crime scene, Donovan said, putting on latex gloves. The shower was a large room with age-darkened tiles and rusty pipes under the ceiling. Murphy's body lay in the far corner, partially hidden by one of the partitions. The CSI was already finishing his work. Photographing the crime scene, Donovan stepped closer. Murphy was lying on his side, his eyes open, and numerous stab wounds visible on his body. The blood had almost washed away with the water, but pinkish stains were still visible on the tiled floor. 8 stab wounds to the back and chest, the forensic scientist said as he continued to work. Presumably a homemade knife. Death occurred between 3 and 4 in the morning. Donovan nodded and sat down next to the body. Something in Murphy's posture spoke of surprise, as if death had taken him by surprise. There was no sign of protection on his hands, suggesting that the killer was someone the victim wasn't afraid of. Who discovered the body? Donovan asked, rising guard Samuels on his morning rounds. Baker answered, moving closer. Look, detective, fights happen all the time in prison. It could have been a simple altercation between inmates. Donovan turned to the warden. A trivial altercation doesn't usually end in 8 stab wounds. This was a murder, Mr. Baker, and I intend to find the killer. I want surveillance footage from the last 24 hours, and a list of anyone who might have had access to the shower room at night. Baker pressed his lips together. The camera in the hallway leading to the showers went out 3 days ago. We're waiting for a replacement, and during that time, access to the showers was limited only from 5 to 7 in the evening. Donovan felt the irritation building up inside. It was always the same technical problems, lack of witnesses, the desire to close the case as quickly as possible. Then I want a list of everyone who was near this room that night, guards, inmates, staff, everyone. Baker nodded reluctantly. I'll give you everything you need, but I want you to understand it's in the best interest of all of us to solve this case quickly. The last thing we need is panic among the prisoners. Donovan knew what really bothered Baker. It didn't matter who killed Murphy. What mattered was preserving the prison's reputation and avoiding scrutiny from the supervisory authorities. Donovan had seen it more than once. The system tries to protect itself, even if it means justice won't be served. After inspecting the crime scene, Donovan went to the medical unit. He needed to talk to the prison doctor to learn more about the victim's medical condition before he died. Doctor Lucas Freeman was sitting at a desk filling out some paperwork. He was younger than Donovan expected, about 40 years old. with tired eyes and premature gray on his temples. When Donovan entered, the doctor looked up and smiled weakly. "Detective Donovan, I've been expecting you. Have a seat, please." Donovan sat down in the chair across from the doctor. The office was small but clean and unexpectedly cozy. On the desk was a photograph of two smiling girls. "What can you tell me about Thomas Murphy?" Donovan asked. Freeman sighed and took off his glasses. "I've been his attending physician for the past 2 years. Thomas was a difficult patient. Not in the health sense, he was rarely sick, but he was withdrawn, reluctant to talk about himself. Had he had any recent health problems?" Freeman paused, as if deciding exactly what to say. "Detective, what I'm about to say should be kept between us for the time being. A week ago, I got the results of Murphy's routine tests. He was found to be HIV positive." Donovan froze. That was a game changer. He knew about it. "Yeah, I told him 5 days ago." He was, shocked, of course. He didn't believe it at first, demanded a retest. When the second test also came back positive, he just shut up. Sat there, in the same chair as you, staring at the same spot for at least 10 minutes. Then asked who else knew about it, and who did. Just me and him. "The test results are confidential. I had to inform the prison authorities, but the patient needs time to realize the diagnosis." Murphy asked for a week before the information could be passed on. Donovan pondered what he'd heard. HIV-positive status in a prison environment could have been a death sentence, even without a knife-wielding killer. How do you think he could have gotten infected? Freeman shook his head. HIV doesn't come out of nowhere, given that his tests were clean before prison. The infection happened here. There aren't many ways: unprotected sex, shared needles for tattoos or drugs, contact with contaminated blood. Did Murphy have a close relationship with any of the inmates? I can't say for sure. Detective prison is a separate world with its own rules. A lot of things stay in the shadows here. Freeman sighed. But I can tell you that Thomas often came in after visits from one Michael Clark. They were officially attending the same psychological support group. Donovan made a note in his notebook. "What can you tell us about this Clark?" "He's in here for armed robbery long time. He's an influential figure among the inmates, charismatic, knows how to sell himself, doesn't cause problems for the administration, but he keeps a certain segment of the prison population under control. So he's a man you don't want to mess with." Exactly talking to Dr. Freeman gave Donovan a new perspective on the case. HIV infection could be a motive for murder if Murphy threatened someone with disclosure of the status, or if someone feared they might have been infected. After talking to the doctor, Donovan asked to see Murphy's cell, a small room with a bunk bed, a narrow table, and a metal toilet. The other prisoner with whom Murphy shared a cell was not there now. The guard said he had been moved to another cell for interrogation. Donovan scrutinized Murphy's meager belongings. A few books, mostly science fiction, a couple of photographs of a young woman who appeared to be his sister. Donovan made a mental note to find her contacts. A tattered deck of cards. He shifted the thin mattress and ran his hand over the metal frame of the bed. Nothing. Then looked under the bed, checked the table. Finally, pushing aside one of the books on the shelf, he noticed something behind it. A small, tattered paperback notebook, hidden in a narrow gap between the wall and the shelf. Donovan carefully pulled the find out. It was a diary, judging by the dates, that Murphy had kept for the past 6 months. The detective flipped through a few pages, neat handwriting, short entries about daily life in prison, thoughts about books Murphy had read. But in the last few pages, the tone of the entries changed. They became more emotional, more confusing. One entry, dated the day Murphy learned of his diagnosis, contained only one word, written in large letters: "Why?" And on the penultimate page was a note: "He needs to know I can't keep this to myself any longer. If M really loves me like he says he does, he must know the truth regardless of the consequences." Tonight everything changes. Donovan closed the diary and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Now he had a lead. The mysterious M, most likely Michael Clark, and the conversation that would take place on the eve of Murphy's death. Sitting in his assigned office, Donovan pondered what he had learned. Thomas Murphy, a young man serving time for a non-violent offense, discovers he has HIV. He plans to tell his partner, and the next day, he is found dead. Donovan looked at the crime scene photo. The 8 stab wounds spoke of more than just murder. They spoke of rage, of personal offense, of betrayal. The killer didn't just want to eliminate Murphy, he wanted to punish him. The detective took a sip of his now-cooled coffee and opened the journal to the first page. He was going to learn more about Thomas Murphy's life and what had led to his death in the cold prison shower room in the early morning hours. Night had long since fallen on Morgan Hill Prison, but Ray Donovan still sat in his assigned office. The light of the desk lamp fell on the pages of Thomas Murphy's diary, creating a golden circle beyond which darkness reigned. The footsteps of guards making their nightly rounds could be heard occasionally in the corridor. Donovan flipped through the pages of the diary, immersing himself in the world of a man who was no longer alive. The first entries had been restrained, scant observations of prison life, notes on books he'd read, but about a month after the entries began, the tone changed. References to M appeared. Short, cautious phrases, at first filled with distrust and wariness, then with increasing interest. Today, M sat next to me in the dining room. Strangely enough, his presence inspires calmness. There are so few people here to really talk to. M talked about his life before prison. He grew up in a small town in Ohio. Knew he was different from the age of 12. I never thought of myself that way, but it's different here. The lines are blurring. Gradually, the recordings became more personal, more candid. Donovan could feel Murphy's attitude toward Clark changing, from wary interest to deep affection. We met today in the laundry room. 20 minutes alone here seems like an eternity. M says he wants to start a new life after his release. Says I could be a part of it. Sounds like a fantasy, but I catch myself thinking about it. There were also recordings of a more intimate nature. Talking about physical intimacy between the two men, Donovan wasn't surprised. Such relationships weren't uncommon in a prison environment, though usually hidden from view. But something about Murphy and Clark's relationship went beyond a simple prison romance. M says he loves me. At this point, such words sound like mockery, but when I look into his eyes, I believe him. No one has ever looked at me like that. Donovan put aside his pencil and rubbed his eyes. It was past midnight, but sleep would not come. The story unfolding before him in the pages of his diary was both simple and complex. Two people in a confined space had found comfort and something more in each other. But like any relationship, this one wasn't perfect either. About 2 weeks before Murphy's death, the tone of the notes changed dramatically. Had a fight with M. He says I think too much about the future, that I dream the impossible. Maybe he's right. What could we have beyond these walls? But if we don't dream, how can we survive here? And then, a few days later, an entry that made Donovan tense. Last night was with D. Don't know why I did it. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could. Maybe I wanted to get back at M for what he said. D has had his eye on me for a long time. He says he's in love, but we both know that's not true. Everyone here is just looking for comfort. He was tender, but afterward I felt only emptiness. Donovan reread the entry several times. Murphy had been intimate not only with Clark, but also with someone else labeled D. And it had happened after a fight with Clark, seemingly to spite him. And 2 weeks later, Murphy learns of his HIV-positive status. The detective straightened in his chair, suddenly realizing a possible connection. If Murphy had contracted the virus from this D and passed it on to Clark, it could be a motive for murder. A strong motive, jealousy mixed with fear for his health and reputation. The last entries in the diary were becoming more and more disturbing. I can't believe this is happening to me. Dr. F said that with modern therapy, I could live a normal life. But what kind of life would it be? Who am I now? A label, a diagnosis, a problem. M needs to know. But what if he turns his back on me? And finally, the last entry, made on the eve of his death. Talk to M. Today, it went worse than I expected. I didn't think I'd see such rage in his eyes. He screamed that I betrayed him, that I ruined his life, said that now he could be infected too. I tried to explain that I didn't know, that the night with D was a mistake, that I only loved him, but he wouldn't listen. For the first time, I was truly afraid of him. Donovan closed the journal and leaned back in his chair. A picture of what had happened began to emerge in front of him. Murphy and Clark had been in a relationship. After the fight, Murphy had spent the night with another inmate. from whom he had probably contracted HIV. When Murphy learned of his diagnosis, he told Clark reacted with rage, feeling betrayed and fearing for his health. And the next day, Murphy was found dead. Donovan began the next morning by visiting the cell where Michael Clark was being held. Unlike many other prisoners, Clark was held in solitary confinement, a privilege that spoke to his status in the prison hierarchy. Clark was waiting for him, sitting on the bed with a relaxed, almost bored look. He was about 35 years old, but he looked younger, trim, with correct facial features and attentive dark eyes. He had a tattoo on his left arm, an intricate pattern rising from wrist to shoulder. "Detective Donovan," Clark said without getting up. "What an honor, Mr. Clark." Donovan took a seat in the only chair in the cell. "I'm here about Thomas Murphy's death." Clark's face didn't change, but Donovan could see his shoulders tense. "It's a sad story, but it happens in prison. Murphy was too soft for this place. Were you close to him?" Clark smiled, not warmly, but rather mockingly. "We knew each other, if that's what you mean. We attended the same counseling group, but close." He shook his head. "There's no real intimacy in prison, Detective. It's every man for himself." Donovan pulled out a notebook. "Still, a few people have seen you together more often than just in group sessions. People like to gossip." Clark shrugged. "Especially here, where there's so little entertainment." "Where were you the night he was killed? Between 3 and 4 in the morning? In my cell? Where else?" Clark spread his hands. "Ask the guards. The guards report technical problems with the security camera in your cell block at exactly that time." "How convenient." Clark smiled coldly. "But that's not my problem, Detective. I slept in my cell all night. You can check the locks on the doors, they're electronic. They record every opening." Donovan knew that was true and had already requested the data. But he also knew that every prison had ways of bypassing security. "When was the last time you saw Murphy?" Clark thought for a moment. "The day before he died. I think just a glimpse, in the cafeteria. You didn't talk to him the night before he died?" Something flickered in Clark's eyes. Wariness, maybe fear. "No." His voice was steady, like I said. "I only saw him in the dining room." Donovan decided to change tactics. "Mr. Clark, Thomas Murphy kept a diary. He wrote a lot about your relationship, about your conversations, your intimacy." Clark's face froze. Murphy was a fantasist. Just because he wrote something, there doesn't mean it happened. He also wrote about your last meeting, about how you reacted to the news of his HIV status. Clark jumped to his feet, his face contorted. "That's a lie! I had no relationship with Murphy, and I didn't know anything about his illness until—" He paused, realizing his mistake. "Until what, Mr. Clark? His death? But you just said you hadn't spoken to him the night before." Clark slowly sat back down on the bed, his face impenetrable again. "I heard from the other prisoners word travels fast." Donovan knew Clark was lying. No one but Dr. Freeman and Murphy himself knew about the diagnosis. "And probably the killer, Mr. Clark. I'm trying to understand what happened to Thomas Murphy. If you had a relationship, if you were the last person to speak to him before he died, it's important to the investigation." Clark looked straight into Donovan's eyes. "I had no relationship with him. We weren't close, and I had nothing to do with his death. That's all I can tell you." Walking out of Clark's cell, Donovan felt disappointed. He was sure Clark was lying, but it was hard to prove it. There needed to be witnesses to their last conversation, surveillance footage, something concrete that could link Clark to the murder. He spent the evening interviewing other inmates and staff. Most either knew nothing or didn't want to talk. The prison code of silence was strong, but gradually Donovan pieced together the fragments of the mosaic. One guard recalled seeing Murphy and Clark together the evening before the murder. They were arguing heatedly about something in the hallway leading to the library. Another inmate reluctantly admitted that Murphy and Clark were close, if you know what I mean. And finally, the breakthrough, a young inmate named Daniel Torres, who shared a cell with Murphy Thomas, came back to the cell late at night, just before lights out, Torres said. He wasn't himself. Pale, hands shaking. I asked him what happened, but he just shook his head and said it was over. When I asked what exactly was over, he said, "Everything, my life, my relationships, everything." Did he say anything about Clark? Torres looked away nervously. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Clark is not a man to mess with. I'll guarantee your safety," Donovan said. "But I need to know the truth." Torres sighed. Thomas said that Michael threatened him. Said Michael accused him of ruining his life because of the disease. Thomas was terrified. I'd never seen him like that. He said that if anything happened, I needed to know it was Michael. That was something, not direct proof, but serious evidence. Donovan decided to return to the shower room where Murphy's body had been found. He wanted to take another look at the crime scene. Maybe find something that had been missed the first time it was late at night. The prison had fallen into silence. The shower room, lit only by the dim glow of the emergency lamps, looked even more gloomy than it had during the day. Donovan walked slowly through the room, mentally reconstructing the scene of the murder. This was where Murphy had been standing when the killer had entered. He probably didn't immediately notice the danger. You can't show fear in prison. You can't look over your shoulder every second. The killer approached from behind, silently, like a predator. Maybe Murphy heard the footsteps, but didn't pay any attention to them in prison. There is always someone walking. There is always movement and noise. The first blow came in the back, professional, precise, not fatal, but strong enough to make Murphy stagger and turn around. And that's when he saw the killer's face, the face of a man he was close to, someone he probably trusted. A second blow struck him in the chest. Then another, and another. Rage, pain, betrayal, all mixed up in those blows. The killer didn't just want to kill. He wanted to punish. 8 blows is not an accident. It's a symbol. Murphy probably tried to defend himself, but the odds were stacked against him. Maybe he tried to talk to the killer, to beg, to explain, but it was too late. The final blow struck him in the heart, and Murphy fell to the cold tile floor. The water from the shower washed away the blood, but it couldn't wash away the fact that another life had been cut short within these walls. Donovan stepped out of the shower room, feeling a heaviness in his chest. He was almost certain that Clark was the killer. The motive, the opportunity, even the threatening testimony, everything pointed to him. But in prison, things were more complicated. Evidence could disappear, witnesses could be silenced, and the truth could be distorted beyond recognition. Sitting in his makeshift office, Donovan reviewed the surveillance videos. Most of them showed nothing useful: prisoners and guards walking down the corridors, the usual prison routine. The camera that might have captured the entrance to the shower room, he'd been told, wasn't working. But on one of the recordings made by a camera at the far end of the hallway leading to the showers, Donovan noticed something interesting. At 3 hours and 15 minutes a.m., about the time forensics believed the murder had occurred, a figure walked down the hallway. The poor lighting and camera angle made it impossible to make out the face, but the build and gait were familiar. Donovan scrolled the tape back and forth several times, trying to improve the quality of the image, to no avail. But he was almost certain the man walking toward the showers at the time Murphy had been killed there looked like Michael Clark. It wasn't direct evidence. Any lawyer could have smashed such evidence to smithereens. But combined with the other facts, the motive and the witness testimony, it added up to a compelling picture. Donovan closed the laptop and rubbed his eyes. He would talk to Clark again tomorrow. Perhaps, when confronted with the evidence, the man would break down and confess, or at least make a mistake that would give him away. In the meantime, the detective could only imagine the last moments of Thomas Murphy's life. The moment he stood under the jets of water, washing away the fatigue of the day, unaware that these were his last minutes. The moment he turned around and saw the face of the man he may have loved holding a knife. The moment he realized he would never leave these walls, never start a new life, never atone for his mistakes. Ray Donovan sighed and closed the case file. Tomorrow would be a new day, new questions, new answers, and perhaps justice for Thomas Murphy. Ray Donovan couldn't sleep. The last 2 days of the Thomas Murphy murder investigation had been spinning in his head like a kaleidoscope, shards of facts, loose ends, false testimony. Something wasn't adding up. Everything pointed to Michael Clark, but Donovan felt there was a missing piece in the case, without which the full picture did not come together. Morning found him in the prison archives, where he arrived before dawn. Warden Baker, against custom, did not obstruct when Donovan asked for access to the prisoner's personnel files and visitation logs, perhaps resigned to the fact that the investigation would be handled properly, not scuttled as he had hoped. At first, Donovan went through the records methodically, paying particular attention to the intersections of Murphy's, Clark's, and Torres's names. He was looking for some connection other than the obvious, something he might have missed before. And he found it in the library's visitation log. Murphy and Clark were often there at the same time, which confirmed their close relationship. But there was something else. Torres, Murphy's cellmate, always arrived a few minutes before them and left later. Could he have been watching them? Donovan recalled Dr. Freeman's words that Murphy often visited him after his meetings with Clark. But now, looking at the medical unit records, he saw that Torres had visited Freeman too regularly. On days when medications were dispensed to patients with chronic illnesses, Donovan had a suspicion and decided to test the hunch by requesting Torres's medical records. It was a breach of confidentiality, but in the context of a murder investigation, justified flipping through the file, he stopped at the diagnoses page. HIV infection, diagnosed 15 months ago, patient is receiving antiretroviral therapy. That was the first piece of the puzzle that was missing. Torres had been HIV positive even before he met Murphy. Could he have intentionally infected Murphy? And if so, why? Donovan returned to Murphy's journal, rereading the entries regarding the mysterious D. In light of the new information, he was now certain that D was Daniel Torres. Murphy had written about being intimate with him after the altercation with Clark, but had not mentioned that Torres had warned him about his HIV status. Does that mean Torres hid his diagnosis? Or did Murphy just not see fit to write it down? A conversation with Torres was required, but first Donovan decided to question the other inmates again, especially those who might have known about the relationship between Murphy, Clark, and Torres. One of the prisoners who worked in the library reluctantly admitted that he had often seen Torres watching Murphy and Clark from behind the bookshelves. He looked at them like a hungry dog at a piece of meat, the inmate said, glancing around nervously. But not both of them. Just Murphy. Everyone knew little Danny had a crush on him, but Murphy chose Clark Powers attractive, you know. And Torres, he's weak, but he's smart. Did Torres ever threaten Murphy? Or Clark? Not directly. But I heard him tell Murphy once that he'd regret his choice, that Clark wasn't who he said he was. Another inmate who worked in the laundry room recalled a conversation overheard a few days before the murder. They were yelling at each other, Murphy and Clark. Murphy was yelling that if Clark left him, he'd tell everyone about their relationship. And Clark laughed and said that no one would believe him, that Murphy had no proof. Was this blackmail? Donovan clarified, call it what you want, but Murphy was desperate. And a desperate man can do a lot of things. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Murphy blackmailed Clark by threatening to expose their relationship. It was a desperate move, an attempt to hold on to a man who may have already decided to break up with him after the news of his HIV infection. Back in his temporary office, Donovan found a message from the tech department. They had checked the security cameras from the night of the murder and had found something interesting. While the main camera by the showers was indeed down, there was another one, hidden in a nearby hallway, installed as part of a special operation to detect drug trafficking in the prison. Most of the guards were unaware of it, and Warden Baker had probably forgotten to mention it. Donovan immediately requested footage from that camera, and an hour later was reviewing the video from the night of the murder. The quality was not perfect, but enough to discern what was going on. At 3 hours and 10 minutes, Thomas Murphy entered the shower room at 3:17 a.m. Michael Clark went in as well. A little later, at 3 hours and 20 minutes, Daniel Torres crept up to the shower room. He didn't go inside, but stopped at the ajar door, clearly watching what was going on. Clark came out of the shower room at about 3 hours and 35 minutes. He looked calm, even content. Torres quickly stepped back into the shadows so as not to be seen, and after Clark disappeared around the corner of the hallway, entered the shower room. Donovan tensed. This was it, the moment of truth. But the tape cut off here. The camera only showed the entrance to the shower room, not what was happening inside still. It was a solid piece of evidence. Torres lied about his whereabouts. The night of the murder, he hadn't slept in his cell. but had watched Murphy and Clark and then entered the shower room right after Clark left. Donovan requested another meeting with Michael Clark. This time he decided to be more direct, Mr. Clark. He began without preamble. We have a videotape showing that you were in the shower room with Thomas Murphy the night he was murdered. Clark looked surprised, but quickly pulled himself together. If you have that footage, you also know that I came out of there long before he died and that he was alive when I left. What happened between you two that night? Clark looked at Donovan for a long moment, as if assessing how much the detective already knew and whether it was worth telling the truth. Thomas Murphy wanted to talk. He called me over there. What was the conversation about? About us? About his diagnosis? About what's next? Was he blackmailing you? Clark's lips twitched in a slight chuckle. He tried. Said if I left him, he'd tell everyone about our relationship. What part I played in it? Clark shrugged. In prison, reputation is everything. Thomas Murphy thought he could use it against me. And how did you react? Angry at first, of course. But then, Clark suddenly softened. I realized he was just afraid of being alone with his diagnosis. Afraid of losing me. I couldn't stay mad at him for that. So you didn't break up with him? No, we made up. I told him I wouldn't leave him, that we'd get through this together. He was happy when I left alive and happy. Clark looked Donovan straight in the eye. I didn't kill him, detective, I swear. Donovan believed him for the first time in all their time together. Clark spoke sincerely, without his usual mask of cold superiority. Do you have any idea who might have done it? Clark thought for a moment. Maybe his neighbor, Torres. He was obsessed with Thomas, always watching him, watching us. Murphy told me that Torres confessed his love to him, but he rejected him. And then when Thomas and I had a fight, he slept with Torres to spite me the one time, he swore, and then he found out he was HIV positive. Yeah, Thomas Murphy was pretty sure he got it from Torres. Clark shook his head. I thought so too. The timing was right. Donovan wondered. Did Torres admit that he had HIV? Thomas Murphy said that when he found out about his diagnosis, he asked Torres directly, and he didn't deny it. Allegedly, he even apologized, saying that he had a low viral load, that the chances of infection were minimal. But the fact remains that after their intimacy, Tomas was infected. Did Torres know about this? I'm not sure. But if he did, Clark didn't finish the sentence. But Donovan didn't need an explanation. If Torres knew that Murphy had wrongfully accused him, and then went back to Clark, that could be a strong motive for murder. With the new information, Donovan ordered Daniel Torres detained for questioning. When he was brought into the interrogation room, Torres looked terrified, Mr. Torres. Donovan began, laying the surveillance printouts on the table. You lied to me about where you were the night of Thomas Murphy's murder. Torres turned pale, but remained silent. We have footage showing that you watched Murphy and Clark in the shower room, and then went in just after Clark left. At the time that forensics say the murder took place, I didn't. Torres began, but he stopped. His shoulders slumped. I didn't mean to do it. It was a confession. Donovan turned on the tape recorder and read Torres his rights. Tell me what happened that night, Daniel Torres. Torres spoke softly, almost in a whisper. I loved him. From the first day he showed up here, he was different. Not rude, not cruel like everyone else around him. He talked to me like an equal, shared his books, his thoughts. But then Clark showed up. Torres's voice became bitter. He bewitched Murphy. His power, his status, and Thomas chose him over me. But then you were intimate with Murphy? Yes, once. When he and Clark had a fight, Thomas Murphy came to me, told me he'd made a mistake, that he wanted to be with me. I believed him, and I told him about my diagnosis, HIV. I told him that we had to be careful and he agreed. But then he found out he was positive. Yeah, and he blamed me. Torres's eyes brimmed with tears, said I infected him on purpose to ruin his relationship with Clark, that I was a monster. He didn't want to hear that I warned him that we were being careful. He wanted someone to blame, and that someone was me. What happened the night of the murder? Torres took a deep breath. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the injustice of it, about how Thomas Murphy blamed me, pushed me away, went back to Clark. I saw him go into the shower room, so I decided to talk to him, explain myself. But when I got to the door, I saw that he wasn't alone. Clark was with him. Torres paused, as if gathering his thoughts. They were talking loudly at first, almost arguing. Thomas Murphy had threatened to tell everyone about their relationship if Clark left him, and then they made up. Clark hugged him, told him that everything would be okay, that they'd get through the illness together. And they were close. Did you watch them? Yes, Torres admitted. I couldn't look away. It was like an obsession. And then Clark left, and Thomas Murphy stayed. He looked happy, so I went in. What did you say to him? I wanted to explain myself, to tell him that I really love him, and I would never hurt him on purpose. I was sure we'd been careful enough. I said I didn't mean to make him sick. How did he react? Torres clenched his fists. He laughed in my face, said I was pathetic, that our intimacy was just a way for him to get back at Clark, to make him jealous, that I never meant anything to him. And now he'd made up with Clark, and they'd be fine, despite the disease I'd given him. There was a strange glint in Torres's eyes. I realized that he would never be mine, that he would always go back to Clark, no matter what. And that's when I saw the knife. One of the prisoners had left it behind. I took it without thinking. Thomas Murphy had his back to me, under the water. He didn't even see me coming, thought I'd gone. Did you hit him? Yes, in the back. First he turned around, saw me, and in his eyes it wasn't surprise, it wasn't fear, it was understanding. Like he always knew it would end this way. Torres lowered his head. I don't remember how many times I hit him. I was in a fog. And when I woke up, he was on the floor, and the water was washing away the blood. Why Torres? Donovan asked quietly. Why did you kill him? Torres looked up at the detective with eyes full of pain. Because I loved him. I really loved him. And he used me. And then he threw me away like a piece of junk. Went back to Clark, even though I was always there for him, taking care of him. Yes, I infected him, but not on purpose, and he just laughed at my feelings. And I realized that if he couldn't be with me, he couldn't be with Clark. Ever Donovan remained silent, watching the broken young man in front of him. Torres had acted out of jealousy, out of a warped understanding of love. He was so in love with Murphy that he couldn't bear the thought of him choosing another. And when Murphy went back to Clark, despite the HIV, despite all the problems, Torres decided that if he couldn't have Murphy, no one would. The case was closed. Donovan had prepared all the paperwork, including Torres's confession and videotapes proving his guilt. Warden Baker was pleased with the quick resolution of the situation and the fact that a scandal had been avoided after all. To the public, it would be just another prison murder, not a story about a complicated relationship, illness, and betrayal. Before leaving, Donovan met with Michael Clark one more time. He was sitting in his cell, flipping through a book that Donovan knew from Murphy's diary that he had given him to read. Torres confessed, Donovan said. He killed Murphy out of jealousy because he'd come back to you? Clark nodded. That's what I thought. Torres has always been unstable, obsessed with Thomas Murphy. How did you feel when you learned of his diagnosis? Clark looked up from his book. Anger at first, at Torres, at the system, at fate, then fear for Tomas, for our relationship. But in the end, I realized it didn't change the way I felt about him. He closed the book. In prison, detective, true affection is rare. And when you find someone who's really important to you, you hang on to them no matter what. Too bad Torres didn't realize that Donovan thought about those words as he left Morgan Hill prison. 3 men bound by a complex relationship, each with their own truth, their own motivations. Murphy, torn between security and passion. Clark, hiding behind a mask of strength and indifference, the ability to love. And Torres, whose love turned into obsession and led to murder. In prison, as in life, secrets had a price. Sometimes it was loss of trust. Sometimes it was loss of freedom, and sometimes it was loss of life itself. And as Donovan drove back into the city, past the gray walls of Morgan Hill, he thought about how the walls that separate people aren't always made of concrete and metal. Sometimes the strongest walls are the ones we build ourselves, out of fear, pride, and misunderstanding.